Tools you're going to need for this include a drill driver with a 5/16 nut driver on the end, some snips, a flathead screwdriver, needle nose pliers, and you'll need a wrench depending on your unit. It may be 10 millimeter or maybe 9/16. And last but not least, an impact with an extension, preferably a wobble extension if you have one, and then a 1/2 inch socket. If you don't have an impact, you can just use a ratchet with this setup. As a bonus, if you have something like a ruler or just a flat piece of metal like this, it may help you when you're trying to line up the sprockets, but it's not mandatory. It's a good idea to put some painter's tape on the motor mount bolt heads before you start. This will keep them from falling out once you remove the nuts on the other side. This isn't mandatory, but it can help. You can also use a block of wood or blocks of wood to hold the bolts in place and to prop the dolly up when you flip it over. So step one, we're going to lay the dolly on its belly like this so we can access it. We're going to take this back cover off. Locate the master link on the chain and rotate the tires until it's on the top of the big sprocket. Use a flathead screwdriver to pop the master link retainer off, but keep a finger on it so it doesn't go flying and get lost. Disassemble the master link and remove it. Lay the chain down out of the way. Loosen and remove the lower lugs on the contactor that hold the motor wires in place. For this, you'll need a 9/16 wrench or possibly a 10 millimeter depending on the model of contactor you have. Cut any zip ties that are holding the wires in place. Loosen the 4 motor mount nuts using an impact or ratchet with a long extension and a 1/2 inch socket. A wobble extension will help here, and you may need a deep socket. Remove the motor from the dolly. Be sure to get all your hardware, your nuts, your washers. Place the new motor in the dolly and make sure all 4 bolts go through the motor mount bracket. If your dolly has these metal strips with holes, they go on next, before the washers. You'll need to lift the motor up to get them to go on. These are optional. The purpose of them is to make sure that the motor mount doesn't bend if you were to hit something really hard. Slide the motor side to side to line the motor sprocket up with the drive sprocket. You can use a ruler or straight edge to help. Place a flat washer, then a lock washer, and then a hex nut for each of the 4 motor mount bolts, and tighten them just enough for the lock washers to start to compress slightly. Place the chain back onto the sprockets. Try to get the ends to line up like this. If the motor has a different tooth count on the sprocket, you may need to add a 1/2 link. When installing the pin through the 1/2 link, be aware that it will only go in from one side, not the other. The pin has to be rotated to line up and go all the way through. Then put the mini cotter pin through the hole and bend it on both sides. Now put the master link back in, making sure to put the plate on before the retainer. Press the retainer back into place using a flathead screwdriver. Check the tightness of the chain. It should only have a slight amount of slack. If it needs to be tightened, turn the motor adjustment bolts clockwise with a 9/16 wrench. Count the wrench turns. Each bolt needs to be turned the same number of times so that the motor sprocket stays aligned with the drive sprocket. Alternate back and forth from one bolt to the other. If one bolt is hard to turn, switch to the other one. If the sprockets get out of alignment, you'll hear a clicking noise when you test it. If that happens, you'll need to fine-tune the alignment by making adjustments to the bolts to get it to run smooth again. The goal is to tighten the chain so that only a small amount of slack remains and the chain runs smooth during testing. Attach the motor wire ring terminals back to the contactor and tighten the bolts. The red wire is furthest away from the motor. Make sure to zip tie the wire out of reach so it can't touch the axle or chain. Run the dolly at full throttle and alternate forward and reverse. Listen for chain noise and grinding. If you hear any clicking, popping, or grinding, double check the sprocket alignment with a straight edge and make adjustments to the motor adjustment bolts until it runs as smooth as possible. Torque the motor bolts down using an impact or ratchet. They should be very tight. And of course the last step is to put this cover back on. You can reuse the screws. Sometimes these holes have a tendency to strip out. If that happens, you can put a screw right next to one of these holes. These are self-drilling and self-tapping screws. So there's two ways to do that. You can either get a bigger screw to go into the existing holes, or what we do is just go right next to it with a fresh screw to make sure everything is tight down and won't fall off on you.